We live in an age of political extremism and polarization. With everyone focused on the extremes, how do we get our politics away from those extremes and back towards the center? Yair Zivan is an advisor to former Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid, and he's also the author and editor of the new book, The Center Must Hold, a book that tries to define a new centrist ideology and practice of politics. Yair joins the podcast today to discuss how he defines centrism, why he believes centrist politics just works, and how to get away from extremism and polarization and to improve people's lives for the better. As always, thank you for listening to the podcast. If you want to subscribe, like, comment, all of that is greatly appreciated. If you really want to support the podcast, you can do so by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism, who supports this podcast. Go to cnliberalism.org/become a member and get access to bonus episodes, our community Slack, and much more. Thank you for listening and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me this episode is Yair Zivan. Yair, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so today we're talking about your book, The Center Must Hold, which is a really interesting book, both in its ideas and kind of in the way it's constructed. And I think the first thing that we should do is talk about how you define centrism, because this is a term that can be contested and that a lot of people kind of reflexively back away from sometimes in politics. Some people embrace it, but some people kind of treat it like a dirty word. So to begin with, let's kind of define what we're talking about. How do you define what is centrism, and what are the core values that you would associate with centrism?
Sure. So I'll give the short introduction and then we can dive into whichever bits of it are the most interesting for you and you want to talk about more. And usually when defining something, you start with the positive, but I actually want to start with the negative, with what centrism isn't. Partly because I think that's why sometimes people have the reaction that you're talking about. Centrism is not the middle. It's not an attempt to find an equilibrium point between where the left and right happen to be at any given moment or on any given issue. Finding the middle is a political tactic. We can talk about it later. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not, but it isn't a political idea. Centrism talks about the ideas that we believe should be at the center of democratic political society, the things that should be at the heart of politics, the set of values and principles, and that we believe, or that I believe, and I think there are other people who contributed to the book as well, should be the organizing principle around which everybody else has to respond. Now, when we think about the greatest threats today to democracy, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more, internally, we talk about the rise of extremism and populism and polarization. Centrism is the antidote to that. It is the counterpoint to extremism, whether that's extremism from the left or extremism from the right. For it to be a political idea, as I believe it is, need to be a coherent set of values. And I'll give just kind of a brief outline of, 4 or 5 ideas to start us off. The first one is, I think centrism is the place where there is an unwavering, unflinching commitment to liberal democracy, which goes against much of the grain of political discourse today, the death of liberalism. Liberal democracy is no longer fit for purpose and we need to find something else. Centrism says no. Liberal democracy is not only good, it's the best form of government that we have, and it's worth defending and fighting for. Not just as an abstract principle, but as a set of institutions, a free press, freedom of speech, an independent judiciary, the core things that make up liberal democracy, a strong and free civil society. Those things are worth fighting for because they create the best possible outcomes, because they create the best possible society if you believe in the values that we do. That's the first. The second thing we talk about in the book a lot, and I think is a key point of centrism and explains a lot of what you see from centrist politicians, is this concept of equality of opportunity. The idea that the primary goal of government is not equality of outcome. My goal is not to make sure that everybody is the same at the end. Nor do centrists believe, though, that everybody can just pull themselves up by their bootstraps, that if you just work hard enough, no matter what, no matter where you started, you'll succeed. The goal is to try to create as close to equality of opportunity as you can by giving everybody the best possible start in life. And then it's up to them if they take it. We believe in individual hard work and in meritocracy, and we believe in entrepreneurship and innovation. Those are things that make societies tick. But we have to understand that not everybody starts from the same point, which is why you see centrists so often focus on, I think, 3 or 4 core policy areas. And I think centrism has answers for a whole host of policy areas, almost everything really. But you often see centrists focus on education. Tony Blair famously with education as the core part of his new Labour campaign. You see a focus on healthcare, which is obviously critical, and on infrastructure, which never gets enough attention in the debate, but without, solid infrastructure that allows people to succeed. And often we talk about kind of either antisocial behavior or crime, which holds people back as well. And you often see centrists focus on those issues as real core kind of policy issues that provide that equality of opportunity.
And not to butt in too much, but also I think you could throw in there you could throw in child poverty in there, whether that's Tony Blair, who famously lowered the child poverty rate in the UK, or here in America, you see like the child tax credit is definitely a from the center kind of position that is, centrist Republicans and New Democrats seem to be the most in favor of.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly right. The third thing I would say, and we can talk about this some more in more depth afterwards, is what we in the book term as liberal patriotism, which is to say that people see their national identity as a core part of who they are, and that's a positive. That's a good thing. We should embrace it. We should encourage it. There's nothing wrong with the fact that you feel a particular tingle down your spine when you hear your own national anthem, and you get more excited when your country wins a gold medal at the Olympics than another country wins a gold medal. That is a positive part of our identity. We feel connected to the people around us, to our communities, and to our nation. What we don't want, and this is where the liberal patriotism bit comes in, is for patriotism to seep over into nationalism, into a hatred of others, into a sense that our superiority is down to other people's inferiority. That's where I think the right takes patriotism in a negative direction. And on the left, there's a kind of a squeamishness about national identity that the center doesn't have. So you will see centrist politicians often very proudly patriotic. The idea of liberal patriotism as a core organizing principle is to create a positive national identity that people can rally around, that gives people a common goal and a common purpose. And if we're thinking about fighting polarization as a core challenge for societies today, liberal patriotism allows you to create that framework, that positive direction that everybody can kind of get behind. Not everybody will always like it, and that's okay. You're not going to get 100% support for anything, but liberal patriotism gives you the framework around which you can organize. The fourth thing I would say is, and you see this in the book a lot for those people that have already read it, this concept of balancing tensions. There are inherent built-in tensions in running a society today. Tensions between globalization and local communities, local markets, tension between security and basic civil rights, between free markets and a welfare state. Almost everywhere you look, the goal of centrism says we need to balance these tensions. The goal is not for one side to win and the other side to lose. And I'll take an example that's prominent in American politics, but is as true everywhere else. If you believe in small government, you believe that the goal should be to make government as small as possible, a centrist would say you have to accept that there are times when that isn't the best approach. If we're telling people they have to stay home during the coronavirus pandemic and we're shutting businesses down, you can't simultaneously argue for small government to stay out of people's way rather than step in to offer people support. So the idea of balancing the tensions and finding the best possible balance at any given time, I think drives a lot of how you make centrist policy. But there's a deeper point to it. And the deeper point to it is that centrism doesn't believe that there is an end goal of a utopian state for your country. There isn't a goal that you get to. It's a constantly managed process. You're always trying to provide the best possible outcomes, to build the best possible society, to give people the best possible chance in life, allow people the most freedom that you can. But there isn't a goal at the end of it. It's not like with Marx, who believes that at the end we get some kind of workers' utopia, nor is it, when you take it to the extremes of the far right, the kind of dreams of a fascist state. It's a constantly managed process. And for that, you're constantly managing the tensions between the different issues that you have to deal with. The last 2 points that I'll make very briefly. One is, and you alluded to this about the word centrism, but there are a whole host of words that centrists embrace and organize around, which have become incredibly unfashionable in politics, that make people kind of step back. And part of what we're trying to do, what I'm trying to do through this book, and others as well, is to kind of say, actually, those words are good. They're what allows society to function. Words like moderation, complexity, nuance, pragmatism, compromise. And we can talk about compromise some more because that's always a big one. But those are the words that allow society to function effectively. Those are the concepts that allow us to live together with people who are different to us and still all pull in the same direction, allowing us to work together. For some reason, those words have become maybe associated with, certainly in the political framework, with weakness or a lack of conviction or being a traitor to the real principles that other people hold. And that is something that I think centrism fights back against very strongly and says, actually, these are the kinds of concepts that need to drive us in terms of how we manage our society. And the last one, and I think this is the one that goes most against the grain of politics today. I think centrism is what the former chief rabbi of Great Britain called the politics of hope. The idea that we should be creating a positive vision for the future and going out to try to make it happen. Politics is so driven by fear and anger and division that it actually has a corrosive effect on our society. It damages not only the political system, but society itself. Offering a politics of hope creates, I believe, a positive loop in society that allows us to better move forward. So not only is it, I think, a good organizing principle as a political approach, and I think it works, the constant argument about what's more effective, fear or hope. But I also think beyond just being a good political organizing principle, it's also the right thing for society. So that's really, by way of introduction, a set of values and principles that I think outline what centrism is.
There is so much in here that I want to get into, and I'm excited to, because it's funny. Sometimes I have people here on the podcast who are different ideologically from me, but I agree with them on a specific policy area. I'll bring in somebody who's much to the left of me or much more libertarian than me, but we agree on some policy area and we talk about that individual policy. And here I think it's the opposite. It's someone who is very much my ideological ally, but we kind of take a different approach to how we talk about it. But just it seems kind of like you're saying, if I paraphrase that wonderful answer you just gave, that look, society has a lot of different people with many different views. There's people who are nationalists who kind of want lots of tariffs and isolationism and things like that. There's people who are conservative and libertarian who want a much smaller government. There's people who are progressive who want big spending programs or maybe even socialist, and they want to nationalize things. And it's kind of like you're saying, if every one of those groups was a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more open to compromise and a little bit more moderate, then society would just work better in general.
So I think it's a bit more than that. One is, I'd love for people who believe in ideological purity to abandon it in favor of a bit more nuance and a willingness to compromise. But it's actually more than that. It's about those things, those words that I laid out, the moderation, compromise, nuance, pragmatism, being organizing principles, being the way that we approach things. So it's not about toning down what already exists on the left and the right, or asking them to take a step in towards each other. It's actually saying, let's start from those places. And maybe I can give an example or an analogy. Maybe if I live in Israel, the Israeli parliament has 120 seats in it. And it's very simple because we only have one body, politically complicated, but we only have one organizing body. So in our parliament, there are 120 seats. If tomorrow there was an election in Israel and I had control of 61 seats out of 120, I had a majority to do whatever I want. And I had a reform or a law or a bill that I could pass with those 61 seats, 61 for and 59 against. Or I could choose to give up on 20% of what I wanted, to water down my ideal for what that reform should look like. In exchange for building a wider consensus, I would choose to do that. Not because I have to. It's compromise from a position of strength. I don't need to do it. I would do it because I think it's a better approach to politics. I think it's the right way to build policy. I think it creates more sustainable policy. I'm humble enough to accept that other people might have something to add into my policy ideas that will make it better. And I think it creates a better political environment. So it's not just about asking others to kind of step in a little bit from their extremes. It's actually saying these basic principles of balancing the tensions and focusing on equality of opportunity and defending liberal democracy. Those are actually the organizing principles around which the political system works. Within that, I accept that there are lots of people who think differently to me. One of the things about working in politics, as I have done for the last decade for Yair Zivan, who was the prime minister, foreign minister, finance minister, a leader of the opposition twice in the time that I've been working with him. One of the things that you learn in politics is sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. That's okay. That's part of the way the political system is. There are people that think differently to us. The goal, I think, is to try to build a coherent approach that allows people to kind of rally around it. It's what we did in the last government here in Israel, and I think it's what we're seeing, again, maybe in contrast to the mainstream narrative. I think it's what we're seeing increasingly in Western democracies happening. So it isn't enough just to ask others to step in. It's to come to the table with a coherent and consistent organizing principle of our own. And I'll say maybe one other thing that I think helps explain it. I'm a proponent of horseshoe theory of the political system. I don't believe that politics is a spectrum. If you think, as I do, that the extremes are closer to one another than they are to the center, it explains why you try to build a broad consensus within that center. But one of the things about building a broad tent, something that you'll often hear centrists talk about, is the tent also has walls. And you have to know who you're shutting out of it. Who you're saying, actually, these people can't be a part of the project that we're trying to build. I'm never trying to build 100% consensus. The goal is not to get absolutely everybody on board or to make absolutely everybody happy. It's to build an effective consensus around the principles that I'm putting forward.
So I'm going to do something now that is a terrible thing to do. And I always tell people not to do it. And now I'm going to be guilty of it. I'm going to argue about the definition of a word. Because it's a dumb thing to do. The ideas are what matter. The actual word itself is less important than the ideas, but I'm going to do it just for one minute here, if you'll forgive me. A lot of the things that you talk about as centrism, whether it's, respect for democracy or kind of building consensus in a pluralistic society, equality of opportunity, a lot of this just strikes me as liberalism rather than centrism, that this is just kind of the basics of liberalism as a political philosophy, kind of small L liberalism. And centrism seems like a strange word to choose for that, simply because, we can say, well, it's not just the middle of two extremes, but kind of inherent in the name, being in the center, means that you are kind of defining yourself as in between two things. Is centrism the right word for this, I guess, is my question.
So I'll be very honest. You're not the first person to raise that, right? Including a few of the people who wrote essays for the book who tried to talk me out of it. Charlie Whelan wrote an excellent book called The Centrist Manifesto. And then when we started talking about this book, he explained to me why he doesn't think it's the word that we should be using. I'll tell you why I think it is anyway. There are a number of reactions to this book, which have been interesting for me. The first tweet I put out about the book, within 20 minutes, I was both a communist and a Nazi, depends on who was responding to me. I was secretly on the far right trying to steal gullible left-wing votes, or I was secretly on the far left trying to steal naive right-wing votes. And, you have that reaction. And that's fine. I enjoy the political back and forth. It doesn't really affect me. And that's the reaction I would expect from the extremes. But there's another reaction which I think is more interesting, which is your reaction now. You work for an organization that has liberalism in their name, and you listen to what I say, and in it you recognize your own political ideology and the word that you use to describe it. I had a similar conversation with somebody who comes from a small c conservative tradition, who said basically the same thing to me. Said, isn't what you're saying really just conservatism? Isn't this what we believe? And I think in that lies the reason why I think centrism is the right word. I'm not defining myself against where the left and right are, purely because if you define yourself around where other people are, then when they move, you move. That's the middle. You have to shift according to where they are in order to keep that equilibrium point. I'm saying, no, actually, this is what I think should be at the heart of the political system, at the center of the political system, and I want them to have to respond to me. If you do centrism well, and I'm happy to talk about the politics side of it as well as the policy side of it, you do centrism well, not only do you win elections, but you force everybody else to respond to what you're laying out, to your approach to politics. You show that that's the most effective political system. Centrism done well has space within it from people that come from a small c conservative tradition and people that come from a small l liberal tradition.
To drill in on that for just a second, when you talk about, you can be a conservative or a liberal and kind of find space for yourself here, you've called this kind of an organizing principle. Do you think that this is more like that, like an ideology? Like is centrism its own form of ideology, or is it a style and a practice of politics? Like, would you call someone a centrist, or are they like a centrist liberal or a centrist conservative or something like that? Is it an adjective or is it a noun in and of itself?
You're taking me back to English literature classes with definitions, but I think you can be, and I would describe myself as a centrist. I think that is my political identity. Now, I'm not yet at the stage where I'm ready to define a book that I've written as the outline to a philosophy. I think that requires other people to drill down far more, and perhaps people with more confidence in themselves to be able to say that they're defining a new political philosophy. But I do think it's a political idea, it's a political approach, and I think it's okay that within it that it encompasses within it that space for where there's an overlap. If you look back, as I did, to Clinton's acceptance speech at the DNC, his first acceptance speech, he talks about community and family and faith, values. Those are things that if you saw them in a moderate, conservative, Republican acceptance speech, wouldn't look out of place either. There is an overlap between classic conservatives and classic liberals, which I think both of them are uncomfortable with because they divide into political parties. And for political parties, you need division and you need a clear gap between the two. But there are also lots of areas where I think where they can both agree. Now, if we can get to the point where we can all rally around the ideas of protecting and defending liberal democracy, and I'm not sure we can at the moment, if we can all rally around equality of opportunity, if we can all accept that actually there needs to be a balance between protecting the poorest in society, but also allowing free markets to flourish, then I think we're getting to a centrist approach to politics, a centrist political idea. That's not to say that there won't be differences. And as I say in the kind of roadmap at the end of the book, the goal here is not to create one party for everyone. It's good that there are competing political parties. It's good that they differ on things. But if they adopt the same approach to politics, you can create a more positive political environment that allows everybody to be more effective. Does that answer the question?
I think so. I mean, I take a lot from this book. There's a lot that I really enjoy about it. A lot of the values, like you've said, are things I identify with as part of my liberal ideology and the style of politics that I like to practice. Whether it's the instinct for pragmatism or kind of the recognition that nuance is required in a complex world. I definitely identify with all of that. I'm curious if you see that style of centrism always being practiced, or if you kind of also see what I'll call bad centrism. I can kind of identify when I look out at the political scene what I would call good centrists versus bad centrists. I think there are some centrists who definitely exemplify the values that you're talking about. But I also do see kind of genuinely some people who are the dumb kind of centrists that you're pushing back against, the kind of people who are like, in an American context, well, Bernie Sanders is too extreme, but let's just take his idea and scale it down by 50%, and that's fine. And on the right, you might see something like, well, Trump is a lot. Trump is way too much, but I'll just agree with half of what he says. And there actually is that kind of, disagreeable, kind of unprincipled, just watered down moderation sometimes. I'm curious, like, how do you see that impacting kind of the project that you have to kind of define centrism in a more positive light?
So I will absolutely stipulate that there are people that call themselves centrist or try to portray themselves as centrists and do it a disservice, on the condition that you don't ask me to name names in other people's political systems. But yes, there are clearly people who I think look for the political middle point, which is something that I distinguish very clearly from centrism. The attempt to say we have two political parties, one is here, the other is there. Where's the middle between them? Where's the place where I think is the average, is the 50-50 split between them? I think it's an entirely wrong approach to politics. I think it forces you to be defined by other people. I think it's unprincipled. I think it's ineffective. I think it's uninteresting. I can see why sometimes it might work as a tactic, but I don't think it's a political idea, as I said. And there are definitely people that do that. I want to go back a second to what you said before, though. I would imagine, without knowing a whole lot about your politics, that you could identify a number of people who would call themselves conservative, who you feel more closely aligned with politically than people in the Democratic Party, people who are on your side of the political map. There would be people who are maybe would also call themselves liberal, maybe would call themselves progressive, maybe would use other labels, but would in theory be in your camp that you feel less affinity to than people who are across the divide. I think that's where centrism comes in, because it is possible that some of the alignments that we have that are necessary, they're political and that's fine, don't best represent actually where our political ideas are. And there are interesting cases like this all over the world. Sometimes that splits, right? Sometimes you have a figure like President Macron who steps into that space and says, actually, there's a large group of people who used to be socialists and used to be Republicans who agree much more with each other than with the radical wings of their own parties. When that's the case, you can create an alternative framework. It doesn't work in every system. In the American system, I struggle at the moment to see how you would create an alternative framework to the two-party system. But I would imagine there are plenty of people who would like to see more bipartisanship, who would reward people who are able to cross the aisle from one side to another, because actually they realize that a moderate on the other side is more like them than the radicals in their own party.
One of the themes that many of the essays in the book touch on, and the book is really interesting, by the way, for everyone listening. It's not just Yair giving a lecture for, 200, 300 pages. It's got a lot of thinkers in there. I couldn't possibly list them all because there's 40 or 50 different essays or something like that. But you've got Tony Blair, you've got Mike Bloomberg, you've got a lot of big names. And one of the things that I saw many people mention was that we live in an age now of polarization, that the extremes in politics on the left and the right both seem to be flourishing. It depends on what part of the world you are in, but in some parts of the world, an extreme leftist form of government is kind of ascendant. In some parts of the world, the nationalist right, the authoritarian right, is really concerningly grasping at power. And that in this age of polarization, centrism is really important. I'm curious what you think is kind of the cause of this polarization that we see. If we're seeing a wave of polarization over the last decade, what's causing it? Because you're kind of positioning, obviously, centrism as an antidote to that, and I think there's some value there. But, to understand how to cure the disease, I think we need to understand where the disease came from. I'm curious what you see as the origins of this polarization problem that we've had.
So I think there are a few, and it's hard to isolate one. And I'll kind of stipulate that I'm not an expert on the history of polarization or populism. There are people who have written, I think, much more eloquently than I could about the root causes and where it comes from. There are a few things I think that are worth thinking about as causes, because they're things that we can do something about. Part of it is the nature of the way we get our information today. So that's social networks, information bubbles, which drive us, I think, into a place where we rarely hear people that think differently. That is reflected in the real world, in divisions of who we mix with, who we see. Breakdown, I think, of traditional civil society, where we would have met people very different to ourselves, who thought differently to ourselves, and realized that actually we agree on all sorts of things. And even when we don't, we're able to sit and have a meal together or have a drink together. I think that's certainly part of it. Part of it, I think, is what Lee Drutman, the political scientist at New America, calls a doom loop, which is just politics feeding into itself. We've come to a point where we believe that every single election is existential for our country. And the stakes are so high, far too high, on every single election about whether we win or we lose. And that creates, I think, a sense that you have to rally around your side completely, entirely, that winning is a form of saving your country and losing is potentially the end of the world. That those stakes are not healthy for politics. Now, that's not to say politics isn't important. I'm the last person to say that. I think it's incredibly important. And there are places where elections really are critical for the future of the country and have an enormous impact. And again, personal example here in Israel, I think about what would have happened if we hadn't have lost the election in November 2022, when we look back at the last nearly 2 years of this country. And I imagine it would have been dramatically different, significant in so many ways. And I'm sure the next election here will be incredibly, incredibly important. But as a rule, not every election is existential. And when you tone down a bit the importance or the sense of emergency around every election, you allow people to kind of soften a little bit and remove some of that polarization. So when you combine all those factors together, I think that's one part of it. There is another part which requires a bit more self-reflection on the part of centrists, I think, people who are like-minded. And that is, we haven't always done a good enough job at really listening and understanding, reacting to very genuine grievances that people have. Not everyone that's worried about immigration is a racist. Not everyone that's worried about globalization is a nationalist. Not everyone that's worried about technological advances is backwards. Those are genuine concerns that people have, and for very good reason. If your factory closes down in your town and the jobs are moved abroad, that factory, which was a key part of the social fabric of the town, not just a source of employment, it is understandable that you are worried about globalization or automation or whatever the cause is. And we haven't always done a good enough job at really listening and understanding where people's concerns are and then responding to them. When politics disappoints people, it's natural that they look for people who offer them simpler solutions, who offer them more complete solutions. Now, I don't think those solutions work, ever. And I think people who offer very simple solutions to very complicated problems, somewhere down the line, end up disappointing the public as well. But part of it is a response. And, I look at the example of the Netherlands, where, again, personal opinion, Mark Rutte, I think, was a very good prime minister for a long time. But I think he will admit, and people around him, I think, will admit as well, that the inability to deal with the housing crisis meant that people went to a more populist kind of politics. If there is a sense that there's a detachment between politics and people's daily lives and the real issues that they face, or worse than that, there's a disdain for people and for the issues that they care about, that drives a sense of polarization, and with it, a move to populism and to extremist solutions to things.
So I want to play devil's advocate here because I really do kind of agree with a lot of what you're saying. And temperamentally, this is how I approach politics in a lot of ways. There's a lot of areas of economic policy and foreign policy where just nuance is required. You can't talk about our tax system in a sense of like, raising more money is always good or cutting taxes is always good. Those things just aren't true. Foreign policy is hellishly complicated, and I'm glad I don't have to deal with it very much. So I temperamentally agree with you on a lot of this, but I want to play devil's advocate and ask, what about instances that really are just that simple, where there really is just one correct view, and rather than compromise, maybe you should just crush your opponent and get the right thing implemented, and that will be the right solution forever. And it really is just very simple. You've got to do the right thing. I could toss out a particular American example. I don't know if it would have any meaning to you, as a Brit and an Israeli, but like the Jones Act, for instance, which is a terrible set of regulations in the United States that says that, related to our shipping industry, that it has to be domestic ships that go back and forth between U.S. ports, and not to get into the details of it, but every single expert agrees that it's just one of the worst pieces of legislation that's ever been passed and is a drag on our economy, and we just need to get rid of it. And there's kind of some special interests that keep it in place because they like having the special interest exemption that they've got. What about, I guess I'll phrase the question this way. Are there instances where you should abandon the instinct for compromise and just go full steam ahead and get your idea implemented? Is that ever part of the toolbox of a centrist?
So, yes, is the short answer. There are times when there isn't somebody to compromise with, right? The idea of the kind of compromise that I'm talking about is that it works when there's a partner on the other side. And if you create the positive type of politics that I think you can create, then there is a partner on the other side. When you're met with somebody who just simply isn't interested in that, then sometimes you have no choice but to go ahead. I don't want to confuse moderation and pragmatism and complexity and all those concepts which we keep coming back to with being radical on some things. And I think it requires us sometimes to be very strong. If you read the essay on free speech in the book, it's probably as close to free speech absolutism as you're going to find in a political work today. And I think that's right, and I stand behind that. I think on issues like the environment, it's clearly an emergency situation that we have to deal with. But again, if you look at the article, the essay on the environment, it talks about the pragmatic solutions that will actually work, the things that will actually help us deal with it, which go hand in hand with the need for energy abundance, particularly in the developing world. So there are times when you absolutely have to do that. And I think this is something that comes back to maybe the first point I made about the commitment to liberal democracy and that not being an abstract. Centrism today is the place where you fight against most strongly, most committed way possible against those people who want to tear down liberal democracy, the institutions, and the cultures that make it work. It is, I think, the place where you're least willing to compromise. Now, again, I'll give it a domestic example from Israel, but I actually think you can find these examples everywhere. The party that I work for, Yesh Atid, which is led by Yair Lapid, refuses to work with Otzma Yehudit, with the far, far right of the Israeli political spectrum. We don't sign bills with them. We don't do joint debates with them. We don't sit in a coalition with them in any local municipality in the country. We just don't. We take the hardest possible line against them. There isn't room for compromise with people like that. And so I think you have to know where that situation. There clearly are times when things are right and wrong. But I'll give maybe a slightly more complicated example. I believe in gay rights. I think it's absolutely a no-brainer for me that two people should be able to get married if they want to get married. I have believed that for as long as I can remember. And I watched the progress towards gay marriage in the UK when I was growing up. And it was much slower than I would have liked. I was ready for it 10 years before. But I look at it now, And I say, actually, that process that was a little bit slower, even though I was very clear in my mind that there was a right and a wrong on this, that process, which took longer and brought the public along with it, has actually been more sustainable. It's not a political issue. No one's debating getting rid of gay marriage in the UK. So while sometimes the temptation is to say, I know I'm right, and I know that my principles are 100% correct, and so I'm just going to ram them through, it's not always the most effective long-term strategy, even when that's frustrating and difficult. So to take your example of a special interest, actually finding a way to gradually take it down, remove it, take it out of the equation might end up being a long-term, more effective approach than simply crushing the opponent, as good as that sometimes might feel.
One of the things that I've found really fascinating is the idea that voters reward moderation. And look, like centrism and moderation may not mean exactly the same things, but if you'll forgive me, I'm gonna conflate the two terms for now. And I think there's a pretty strong sense of this in political science. If you actually look at the research in political science literature, there's very strong evidence that voters do reward moderate candidates, regardless of where on the ideological spectrum they fall. If you're more moderate or perceived that way, then voters tend to like you more. You tend to get a higher vote share. But one of the things I always wonder, and I'm just curious if you have a perspective on this, is does the public actually like moderate policy, or do they like the appearance and the style of moderation in their politics? Do they like somebody who appears to be like them and talks like common sense and, it seems reasonable in the way they approach the world, regardless of what their actual policy is? And like the example that I use here is that in 2016, and this shocks a lot of people, but in 2016, if you asked voters who's more moderate, Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, more people said Donald Trump. More people in the American voting public thought Donald Trump was moderate than Hillary Clinton. And I think that's factually wrong, but it is what they thought. And so it leaves me with that question, like, do people actually like moderate policy, or do they just like politicians who are nice and seem reasonable and have a style about them that seems moderate?
No, I think what people reward ultimately is moderate policy that works, that's effective, that delivers for them. And I think what the public relates to, and rightly so, is a sense of a person that cares about them, that understands them, that sees them, that's aligned roughly with their values, of course, but also understands them and where they are and what their life is and what's important to them. Moderates should be able to do that. It is, as I said earlier, I think one of my criticisms is we haven't always been good enough at doing that. But the reward, I think, comes from the fact that moderate policies are just far more likely to work and to be effective. And I really believe in the end, what the public is looking for in its elected officials is that they care about the people genuinely, that they're interested in them, and that they're doing their best to deliver real outcomes for them. The most damaging thing is when it feels like the elected officials are out of touch, uninterested, detached, living in a different world almost to the people that are voting for them. And I think the public's actually willing to forgive politicians who make mistakes or politicians who aren't perfect. What I think they're not willing to forgive is politicians who seem like they're disinterested in them. And I, again, without jumping too deep into American politics, I wonder in 2016 whether that's what people saw in Donald Trump, whether that was part of the attraction. And that can be interpreted in a survey or in a poll as moderation. But I think it's more to do with being interested in the things that I'm interested in, caring about the things that I care about, being focused on the things that I'm focused on.
Yeah, I think there's a sense in which, at least in the beginning, a lot of people like this style of Donald Trump. They like that he was anti the status quo. There's a lot of hay you can make in politics by just being against the status quo in a very visceral way. And people may have interpreted that as just, I like that, therefore that is moderate.
Without commenting specifically on Donald Trump, but more broadly, there is also a pendulum effect back against that. The Labour Party in the UK, which got elected only a few months ago, a large part of its ability to rebrand in the eyes of the British public was a rejection of the radicalism and populism of Jeremy Corbyn. A sense that actually what we're offering you is something sensible. The British public clearly felt the Conservative Party had lost touch with the public. It was focused on things that weren't the things that the public was focused on. It was focused on itself, and it was out of touch. And Jeremy Corbyn's radicalism and extremism was unappealing. And the Labour Party's success came from rebranding itself against that. As much as it was branded against where the Conservative government was, it was equally pushing back against where the Corbyn wing of the Labour Party had dragged the party. So I think there is a reward for that moderation. The thing that I always say, and we sometimes forget about it in the political part of the discussion and the discourse, is there are ways to win an election once, but ultimately the public wants to see results. You will be judged on whether people feel that their life is better than it was. Sometimes that's in your control, sometimes it's not. Sometimes there are factors that make things incredibly complicated, and I'm certainly sympathetic to the impact of external factors. But ultimately, certainly after a 4-year term, the public judges relatively well, I would say, whether their situation is better or worse than it was before. And being a moderate is effective if you put into place moderate policies, centrist approaches to policy making that are actually effective.
We're coming up on time, unfortunately, but I want to close the podcast by asking kind of the traditional final question that we always ask here, and that is, where can people go to learn more? If they're interested in the ideas that we're talking about, where can they go to learn more? I will start by saying, of course, if you're interested in what we're talking about here, you should go check out the new book, The Center Must Hold, by Yair Zivan. It's a collection of essays, some of them by Yair. You did write part of it. Some of them by a whole host of other very interesting people, politicians, political scientists, people from the media. There's just a really wide range of voices in there. So you should absolutely check that out. I'm happy to recommend your book. But other than your own book, is there anything else you would recommend for people who are just interested in kind of learning more about what we're talking about? This could be, other books to read, other blogs to follow, people who are interesting thinkers to follow in this space. What would you recommend?
So one of the things that's been encouraging for me since the book came out is there is a growing ecosystem, I think, of people who are thinking and writing really interesting things in this space. I'm a big fan of the Liberal Patriot, Substack, which I've written for a couple of times, and I think the team there are fantastic. And I think they're doing some really interesting stuff around this. I think Scanson Center, who I did their podcast and have met with their team. So I've been really encouraged actually everywhere that I've looked, without getting into kind of partisan politics and political space in the US. But I would say there are numerous think tanks today that are working around these sorts of issues. And I would go to the book and to the people that have written in it and read some of their stuff. So, Bill Galston, who wrote a fantastic essay in the book and has a regular column in the Wall Street Journal, Jen Rubin in the Washington Post. There are increasing numbers of centrist voices that are, I think, outlining some really smart approaches to the issues that we're dealing with. The other thing I would say, and this is always difficult, we tend to be very focused on the political horse race, on the next election. And you've got a pretty big election coming up in the US, just over a month from now. But if you look further afield, there are some really interesting things happening, I think, in countries like Poland. I would say the work that we're doing here in Israel in the centrist camp, I think, is really important. And some of the think tanks around what we're doing here in the UK, some of the intellectual work that's being done around the new Labour government, the Tony Blair Institute, for example. So there are lots of places beyond the shores of the United States as well, where I think there's really interesting stuff happening. And that fills me with positivity. And my call, as always, I really think, and I say this with all modesty, I think this is the first book that's tried to create a global picture of what centrism is, and how it fits across the world together. I really hope that there will very soon be another one and another one and another one written by other people who delve deeper into some of the policy issues and who delve deeper into some of the countries, and kind of develop this and take it further. That's the best thing that I could hope will come out of the book.
I agree with almost all of that, and I'll say, obviously we do have a big election in America coming up. I think it's very important for centrists to get out and vote Democrat, because one party, look, both political parties in America have their problems, but it is not a balanced set of problems. One is certainly bigger than the others. In the same vein, I'll say that I really hope to see Israeli elections soon, where Yair Lapid's the party, the collection of parties that you are certainly part of. I really hope you guys do very well in those elections. I hope we see a non-Netanyahu government. I think that would go a long way towards the whole host of things that Israel is dealing with right now. But I hope to see that, and success for you guys. So with that, I think we'll bring things to a close. I want to thank one more time my guest in today's episode, Yair Zivan. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much.